Forget New Year, New You. This season is about slowing down, locking the doors, and cozying up at home with the one you really want to do nothing with. Your dog. After the holiday chaos, those quiet nights with a blanket, a podcast, and your pup feel like the reset you actually need. Ollie helps make those moments easier with fresh protein-packed meals made from real human-grade ingredients, so your dog can enjoy some quality comfort food too. Choose from 5 recipes and get a personalized plan for your dog's needs. Meals arrive perfectly proportioned with a scoop and storage container, so serving is fast and mess-free. And with Ollie's in-app on-demand health screenings, supporting your dog is easy, ensuring more cuddles for many years to come. Visit ollie.com/truecrime and use code TRUECRIME for 60% off your first box.
As many people were taking their lunch breaks in the middle of the day on July 30th, 2014, a veteran Minnesota police officer was conducting what was supposed to be a routine traffic stop. There was no warning that this was going to be an out-of-the-ordinary encounter for the Mendota Heights police officer. Officer Scott Patrick pulled over the green Pontiac Grand Am at 12:20 p.m. But according to what prosecutors would later tell a jury, the man driving the green Grand Am was a criminal mastermind who hadn't registered the vehicle in his name. The driver had an outstanding warrant for his arrest, and he had allegedly warned his girlfriend the night before that he wasn't afraid to use violence if he was pulled over by a cop. Officer Patrick's dash cam video showed what happened next. As he walked up and reached the front bumper of his police car, the driver, whose face cannot be seen, pulled something dark out. The dark object was visible out the driver's side window. Then came the sounds of gunshots. Officer Patrick was shot 3 times. He fell on the ground and the green car sped off. A court junkie listener named Sherry was 21 years old and had just graduated college when she found out that her uncle Scott, one of her favorite uncles, had been killed. The investigation into his death wouldn't take very long, however. By the end of the day, 39-year-old Brian Fitch Sr. was taken into custody following a dramatic car chase ending in a shootout with police. Dakota County Attorney James Backstrom announced the charges against Brian at a press conference later that week.
Officer Scott Patrick had a strong passion to protect and serve the community, and he did so with honor and distinction. He often had a smile on his face and was quick to step up to help other officers in the community whenever needed, above and beyond his regular patrol duties. I think the story that I read in the paper yesterday following this tragedy about Officer Patrick taking time to visit an accident victim in the hospital after she was injured in a car crash that he had responded to some years ago says all you need to know about this man. He truly cared about the people he served and the well-being of others. This has obviously been an extremely sad week for law enforcement in our community. Today we have filed charges of first-degree murder against Brian George Fitch in connection with Wednesday's shooting death of Mendota Heights police officer Scott Patrick. Fitch has been charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, the first involving intentionally shooting and killing a peace officer while that officer was engaged in his official duties, and the second involving premeditation. Both of these charges carry a mandatory life in prison sentence without parole upon conviction.
Brian Fitch Sr. was no stranger to law enforcement over the years. He had been in trouble with the law since he was a minor. His rap sheet included charges for assault, burglary, and other crimes. According to the DA, when Officer Patrick pulled him over, Brian was a wanted man, and a warrant was out for his arrest.
This defendant has a history of violence, hatred toward police officers, and was going to do anything, including murder, to evade capture.
Before his arrest, Brian had been shot 8 times in the shootout, and while under guard at the hospital, authorities said he confessed to killing Officer Patrick.
At one point, while in Regents Hospital, Fitch stated to a St. Paul police officer who was guarding him, and this is a quote, "Just to let you know, I hate cops, and I'm guilty."
But prosecutors wouldn't present any testimony from that hospital confession at Brian's trial, presumably because Brian was heavily medicated and was in bad shape, as his defense had argued. But that wouldn't be the only hurdle the prosecution faced in convincing the jury that Brian Fitch Sr. was their guy. Brian's defense attorney argued that Brian was innocent and that none of the eyewitnesses, even though there were many, had positively identified him. They also claimed that Brian had an alibi, which partly included a confidential informant. Officer Patrick's niece, Sherry, attended at least one day of the trial and followed it closely.
I expected the defense to have nothing, to kind of roll over and accept that there was a dash cam video, there was, prior offenses, all of these things, but I just didn't expect to be surprised by understanding their arguments and wondering if, maybe could it have possibly been someone else?
As for other challenges the prosecution faced, there was, of course, the matter of someone trying to put a hit out on two of their key witnesses. This is Jillian, and in partnership with Law and Crime, you are listening to Court Junkie, episode 202. In the suburbs of the Twin Cities lies Mendota Heights, with a police department just shy of 20 sworn officers. The most senior of those officers in 2014 was 47-year-old Scott Patrick, who had spent almost 2 decades on the force. He had been married for more than 26 years to his wife, Michelle. They were the parents of 2 teenage daughters. On the day he died, he started his shift at 7:30 a.m. It was supposed to be a normal day of enforcing traffic laws, taking reports, and patrolling the neighborhoods. Officer Patrick's daughter and her boyfriend were having a picnic lunch at the park that day. He stopped to visit them. "I'll see you later, sweetie," he told his daughter as he headed back on patrol afterward. Minutes later, at 12:20 p.m., Officer Patrick called in on his police radio to say that he was going to do a traffic stop near the intersection of Dodd and Smith in West St. Paul. It was a commercial area near an auto garage, a gas station, a strip mall, and other businesses. On the first day of Brian Fitch Sr.'s trial in January 2015, the jury watched a pair of videos that captured the final seconds of Officer Patrick's life. His family had watched the videos in advance to prepare themselves so they wouldn't have to see them for the first time in public at the trial. The Pioneer Press described the video's contents. The first showed Patrick inside his car as he began the stop about 12:20 p.m. Just after he stepped out of the frame, 3 shots in quick succession were audible, followed by the shouts of bystanders and eventually police activity. The second video, which had no sound, showed Officer Patrick pull over a green Pontiac Grand Am and step out to approach it. Moments later, 3 shots were fired at the officer from the driver's side window. 1 hit his leg, 1 hit his stomach, and 1 hit his head. The Grand Am sped away the moment the last shot was fired, leaving Patrick to crumple behind it. Multiple people ran over to help. "Officer down," said a strange voice on Officer Patrick's radio. West St. Paul police officer David Cook heard the radio call and rushed to the scene within minutes, his sirens and lights on. Officer Patrick's body lay in the road, 10 feet from his car. His squad car's lights were still on. "He wasn't breathing. He wasn't conscious," Officer Cook testified. "He was very ashen-colored. His eyes were open. He had a very large pool of blood under his head." He said it was clear he was dead. The investigation began immediately from the mobile command post as police departments from throughout the area worked together. Crime scene tape was put up. A bulletin went out for the suspected shooter driving a green Grand Am. Witnesses were interviewed. The shooting happened in broad daylight. Multiple people either witnessed the shooting, heard the gunshots, or saw the green car speeding away. They were asked to recall what they saw, but they all remembered the driver a little differently. Was he bald, or did he have blonde hair? Was he old or young? One witness thought there were two people in the car. The jury wouldn't get a straight, uniformed answer at trial. One of those eyewitnesses was Amy Stickler, a 40-year-old hairstylist who was born and raised in West St. Paul. On that afternoon, Amy had just dropped off her daughter at her parents' house, who lived a block away from the shooting. She was on her way to meet friends for lunch. All of a sudden, I heard two pows, and I didn't think much of it because there was an automotive place there, so I thought it kind of sounded like something that backfired maybe. But then I looked to my left and I saw a green car squeal its wheels and go right in front of me, Amy testified. And when I looked back to see, because then I saw the squad car behind the car peeling off, when I looked back thinking there's going to be a chase, I saw Officer Patrick laying in front of his squad car. The car that passed right in front of her and took off was a 4-door green car, according to Amy's testimony. She wasn't sure of the make or model and didn't catch the license plate. She could see a white man driving, but she couldn't make out a more detailed description of the driver. I thought maybe in his 20s, Amy testified when the prosecutor asked how old the driver looked. I thought he had maybe longer blondish hair, but everything happened so fast. The only thing I'm certain of is he was a white male. Amy froze at the intersection, waiting for Officer Patrick to move or get up, but he never did. Then the scene was surrounded by police officers. Amy recounted everything she had witnessed to them. 4 hours later, she looked through a photo lineup of 6 bald men, but none of them stood out to her. She eventually saw the news reports and the mugshot of Brian Fitch Sr. when he was arrested. Brian was bald. He didn't have a youthful, fresh face. He was 39. Authorities said he had been wearing a baseball cap at the time of the shooting. You'd like to think that law enforcement got it right? Brian's defense attorney, Lori Traub, asked Amy under cross. Yes, Amy said. 27-year-old Joseph McCollum was a bookkeeper for the nearby auto shop. He had an associate's degree in law enforcement and had previously worked as a police reserve in the area, although he gave that up because of the time commitment. Joseph had just happened to take an early lunch at the auto repair when he distinctly heard 2 gunshots. He immediately knew what they were. I heard the sound of a car speeding off, and I walked out the front door of the office, Joseph testified. As I looked to the left, I saw the rear of a green car. When he looked to his right, he saw Officer Patrick lying on his side in full uniform. The law enforcement training, his gut instincts, and his compassion all kicked into gear. Because of his quick thinking, the message got out quickly that an officer was down and a green car was involved. Joseph ran over. I shook his arm and said, "You're going to be all right, buddy. We're going to get help," he testified. When I shook his arm, he was very limp, and so I pushed and rolled him over so he was on his back. What happened next? The prosecutor asked. I could tell he was gone, Joseph said. I've seen people that have passed before, and you could just tell by the way that his eyes were. The prosecutor asked if he attempted to render any first aid. The first thing I did was I noticed that his radio was laying there next to him, so I tried to use his radio for help, Joseph said. I picked the radio up and I tried to talk into it, and then I realized that the radio was off, so I turned it on and I said, "Officer down." He said he was really out of it and he couldn't think of where they were, so other witnesses nearby yelled out the street name. Joseph relayed that info into the radio. And somebody said that they had a partial license plate, And I knew that it was a green car, but I didn't know what the make and model was. And I don't know who yelled it to me, but there were people yelling things. And they gave me a 3-digit number of the partial plate, and they gave me the make and model of the vehicle. And do you recall what that was? The prosecutor asked. It was a Pontiac Grand Am, Joseph said. It was a chaotic scene. Joseph recalled that nobody really knew what to do. A nurse wearing scrubs came over and checked his pulse. She did a couple compressions, but Officer Patrick was losing a lot of blood. Joseph took his shirt off to cover the wound on his head, and then 2 West St. Paul police officers arrived. He said it felt like it took forever for them to respond, but that he knew in reality only about 5 minutes had passed. Dressed in her scrubs, 40-year-old medical assistant Jennifer O'Keefe was leaving a medical appointment, driving on Smith and about to turn onto Dodd. She noticed someone was pulled over, but she didn't think much of it. She took a right-hand turn and then heard 3 gunshots. She described actually watching the officer walk up to the car. He got to about the bumper and I saw him put his arm up and go down to the ground. The moment was surreal, she said. You don't expect to see that, and so you're kind of thinking, did that just really happen? The prosecutor asked her to describe the car that was pulled over, and she said it was a forest green Pontiac Grand Am. How long do you think you looked at this individual in the car? Are we talking seconds? Are we talking minutes? The prosecutor asked. Seconds, she said. She testified about what she saw in those seconds. I mainly remember the eyes because I just looked and thought, what's happening? I had remembered possibly seeing sandy blonde hair, but I didn't know how because they asked me if I saw his hair and I said no, but it might have been scruff or maybe hair down here. This was the best that I could do, she said. The prosecutor asked if the shooter wore a hat or if Jennifer recalled the clothes he wore. No, I don't remember seeing clothing, she said. I was thinking he might have had a hat on because I didn't see hair, so I couldn't figure it out. So I thought maybe he had a hat on. As for his race, she said he was white. Could you tell his age or what did you believe him to be approximately? I thought younger, so 20s, she testified. And anything else you can recall about him? Jewelry, earrings, anything of that nature? Jennifer said no. She was the person in scrubs who Joseph testified gave CPR, but she said the gunshot wounds were so severe and he was bleeding profusely. CPR made it worse. After giving her statement to police, Jennifer also was taken to look at a photo lineup. The first set of photos, I picked 2 because I couldn't decide between the 2, Jennifer said. And then in the second set, I picked one that might be what I thought was close. St. Paul Police Sergeant Jake Peterson testified nobody had correctly picked out the defendant, Brian Fitch Sr., in the photo lineups. Interestingly, the photo lineups contained photographs of a father and son. Sergeant Peterson testified that early on in their investigation, the green Pontiac came back as being linked to a Brian Fitch, but they weren't sure if it was Brian Fitch Sr. or his son, Brian Fitch Jr. He said they created lineups with both of them in the hopes of getting some information from some witnesses. He said Brian Fitch Jr. was ultimately ruled out as a suspect. Under cross, the defense focused on the statements Jennifer gave police. At the time, you told the officer that the suspect was a white male who was younger, early 20s, and had a hat on, the defense attorney asked. Jennifer said yes. The attorney, still reading from Jennifer's earlier statement, said, You also said that the suspect had sandy blondish hair coming out of his hat, and I think he had a little bit of facial hair maybe? Yes, Jennifer said. And at that time, you didn't say anything to the officer that you were uncertain about any part of that description, he asked. No, that's not true, Jennifer said. I told him it happened very fast, and I didn't know why I couldn't picture his hair. It might have been coming out of the back of a hat, or I might have known that from the scruff on his face. I spoke to many officers that day and gave a lot of statements, and so maybe I didn't mention it to him. It all happened, like I said, very fast. and I had to sit and really think about it. It was a very traumatic day. Others who witnessed the green car speeding away described the driver. One woman said the driver looked Mexican. Another said the driver was a bald white man. The trial continued on, with experts taking the stand. Dr. Victor Froloff, the assistant medical examiner for Ramsey County, had completed more than 3,000 autopsies, and he was assigned to do Officer Patrick's. The gunshots to the officer's abdomen and head were serious enough injuries to have killed him, he testified. The leg wound wasn't fatal. The manner of death was obviously homicide. Officer Scott Patrick's niece, Sherry, contacted Court Junkie and suggested I cover Brian Fitch's trial. She described her uncle as one of the good guys. He got in snowball fights with children. He helped a woman who was in an abusive relationship get out. He didn't forget about someone who had been injured in a car crash. Many people shared their stories about Officer Patrick, described as a laid-back patrolman with a great wit, at his funeral and in cards sent to his wife. Here's what one person said.
Scott's work was his dream, and his family was his strength. He was always talking about his family. On the job, he was not going to write the most tickets. He wasn't going to make the most arrests. Heck, he probably would have done whatever he could to get out of paperwork. But what Scott did the best was being himself. Scott would talk with people, listen to them, show his compassion, and always offer up his best advice.
Sherry said her uncle was never afraid to do what was right, even if it meant going up against his own department. Before his death, Officer Patrick reported property theft to his police chief, the culprits being fellow officers. He had seen 2 police officers moving a picnic table to City Hall from an old tennis club that was being torn down, according to local media reports. But Officer Patrick didn't believe enough was being done about his complaint. Instead, he was the one who came under fire. He reportedly felt like he was being retaliated against. He filed a lawsuit against the city of Mendota Heights 4 months before his death, alleging whistleblower harassment and workplace retaliation.
He felt that not enough was being done to give consequences to those internally. And so when he passed away, my aunt actually won the right to kind of continue that fight because it was important to my uncle. Like I said, when he saw doing right was the right thing to do, and he was a good person, and so it didn't matter who was committing a wrong. He wanted to fix it and do the right thing. That story is out there, and I think that just emphasizes that even if it's internally, even if he won't be the most popular guy in the room, he wants justice to be served, and he wanted the right thing to be done.
There was an outpouring of support from the community when Officer Patrick was killed. Police officers wore black armbands in a tribute. Sherry remembered riding in a limo to the funeral. The funeral was televised and bagpipes played. The story was everywhere in the news. The tributes went on for years. In 2018, the city of Mendota Heights put up a granite memorial that displayed Officer Patrick's picture, dressed in his police uniform. Because of all the extensive media coverage and publicity, a judge ruled that Brian Fitch Sr. wouldn't get a fair trial in Dakota County, right outside the Twin Cities. Instead, the trial was moved 90 minutes away to St. Cloud in Stearns County, Minnesota, a more rural part of the state. That was a relatively rare move for a trial to actually get moved to a new location, according to one legal expert.
My name is Michael Benza, and I have 2 jobs. I am a professor at Case Western Reserve University School of Law, and I also have my own private practice focusing on death penalty litigation. So a motion for change of venue is not an unusual motion. especially in the more modern era of pervasive media coverage over particular crimes. So you'll see them fairly frequently. What is unusual is the granting of the motion to change venue. That does not happen very often at all.
But in this case, the crime was known to pretty much the entire community, and the media coverage was very detailed and in-depth, making it hard to find a jury who would be unbiased.
One of the issues for a change of venue is really to focus on why do we want to change venue. And the idea behind it is that defendants are entitled to a fair and unbiased jury. At the same time, the media is needed and has an absolute right to cover and report on the crime and the incident that occurred. And so you have these two competing values. The way that we protect both values is we allow the media to do the report and to tell the people what happened, but then we move the case to a different jurisdiction so that the defendant's right to an unbiased jury or untainted by the media coverage can then decide the issue of guilt or innocence.
Sherry remembered the long road trip as she traveled to the rural part of the state to support her family and watch part of the court proceedings in 2015.
It became real for me when I was traveling to St. Cloud, Minnesota, which is very rural and far away, to go to this trial. And it was a small courtroom with limited seats, and it was very old. And I was living this thing that I had heard about quite quickly.
On the drive to St. Cloud, she noticed blue lights on porches in honor of her uncle's memory. Finally reaching the courthouse, Sherry saw in person the man accused of gunning down her uncle.
It was surreal. You expect him to be kind of bigger than other people or broader, or like look more evil, but he just looks human. But also he looks mean. I don't remember making eye contact with him, and I'm glad. His eyes look mean. In every photo I've seen since, I was happy I saw him from behind mainly, except for when he was being brought in and out of the courtroom. But it was not a pleasant experience, that's for sure.
Brian Fitch Sr.'s former girlfriend was a witness for the prosecution. 29-year-old Taya Moran had met Brian through a mutual friend in 2014, and they started dating. He was sort of her boyfriend, I guess, if that's what you want to call it, Taya testified. On the night before the shooting, Taya and Brian had gotten into a fight, and Brian threatened to break into her apartment when Taya wasn't home. Taya was concerned enough that she called the local police and gave them Brian's name and cell phone number. An officer then made contact with Brian, so he was well aware Taya had been in touch with them. He wasn't too happy that I called the police and gave them his name, and so we talked about that for a long time, and I didn't really talk, I listened, Taya testified. How would you describe his general demeanor, his emotions during this conversation? The prosecutor asked. Up and down, or one extreme to the other extreme, Taya testified. Just like sad and then mad and then, irritated, saying that things were just, scattered everywhere. She said Brian chastised her for hours. He told her she had ruined him, that he thought he had been under the radar of law enforcement, until now. They forgot about me. Now they're going to remember me, she recalled him saying. She said he then vowed to shoot a cop if he was pulled over. She told the court that Brian had a handgun, even though he wasn't allowed to since he was an ex-felon. She said she saw the gun a few days earlier. I think I was in the living room doing something and I walked in and he was doing something with his gun or something. I don't know what he was doing. I just told him to put it away, Taya testified. I believe he asked me if I wanted to hold it, and I said no, just put it away. She also testified that she saw Brian holding a small gun with a laser sight that same day. Under cross, Brian's attorney, Lori Traub, attacked Taya's credibility. On the night of July 29th, when Brian told her he would shoot a cop if he got pulled over, Taya was on meth. Meth was also the only reason Taya's friend had introduced Taya to Brian in the first place. Brian could help her get some, the defense argued. Taya disputed that. The defense questioned why Taya would spend the night with Brian and lay next to him, right after he threatened to shoot at the cops, and chastised her for hours because she had called the police on him. He didn't yell at me, Taya responded. He just lectured me. And Taya also seemed to have potential selfish motivations for testifying for the prosecution, the defense argued. Taya wanted something in exchange. You have a friend who's currently in federal custody facing more than 262 months in prison. Is that correct? Traub asked her. Correct, Taya said. And you spoke with this gentleman several times last week by phone? Traub asked. Correct. And those phone calls were recorded? Uh-huh. And so you know that we know that you and this gentleman came up with this scheme to try and get him out of prison? Traub asked. No, to get who out of prison? Taya asked. Your friend that's in prison right now, Traub responded. He told you repeatedly in those phone calls that you needed to tell the prosecutor you weren't going to say shit unless he got something. Taya denied it. Some of Brian's friends and drug clients were also caught up in the investigation. Brian had bought the green Grand Am in 2001 from his friend. That friend was John Francis Lynch Jr., a 52-year-old who installed hardwood floors for a living and was dating a woman named Lori. Brian sometimes crashed with John and Lori, whom he referred to as his landlords. The green Grand Am, although John testified that he had sold it to Brian, was registered in Lori's name. John said he never changed the registration, but that the title was signed over to Brian. Lori took the stand and testified that Brian drove the green Grand Am, not her, a point the defense would try to dispute. The jury heard that Brian was a drug dealer, that he rotated his cell phones, his addresses, even his cars that were never registered in his name. That mix-up had led the police to Lori's home after the shooting, and they took Lori and John into custody until they realized the suspect they were looking for was actually Brian Fitch Sr. After the shooting, the green car sped off, traveling 70 miles per hour, or faster, and blew past a stop sign. Hours later, around 5:20 p.m., police found the car at a duplex that was only about 1.5 miles from the fatal traffic stop. It was hidden under a blue tarp and parked in the backyard next to a fence. The prosecution called several witnesses who were at the duplex and who testified that Brian was the one who stashed the car on July 30th. However, at times, their testimony contradicted each other about when exactly Brian had arrived. Officer Patrick was shot right after he pulled the car over at 12:20 p.m. One woman staying at the house remembered Brian arriving at about noon, although she said she was in the middle of a meth bender and hadn't slept for 14 days. One person living at the duplex was a man named Jesse, an unemployed construction worker. Jesse often bought meth from Brian. Jesse testified that he used meth every day back then, although he was clean now. Back on July 30th, 2014, Jesse was living with his mom in the duplex when he said Brian called around noon and asked if he could borrow Jesse's mom's blue SUV. Brian said he wanted some obscurity to go out and pick up some meth and dope. Everybody knows who he is, and he didn't want nobody to know he was around with his car, Jesse testified. He said Brian also had enemies. Jesse's mom, who was at the end of her work shift, wasn't eager to lend out her car, but Brian offered her money, and so she agreed. Brian promised to help Jesse's mom catch up on her back car payments. She was behind $800. Jesse testified that when Brian arrived at the duplex, he wanted to park in the garage. Did he indicate why he wanted the car parked in the garage? The prosecutor asked. He said he just didn't want nobody to know he was around, Jesse testified. I said no because there was too much stuff in there. Brian then asked if he could park by a fence in the backyard, which Jesse didn't have a problem with. Brian also asked if Jesse would cover up the car, so Jesse and his friend Katie hid it under a blue tarp. Under questioning from the defense, Jesse's mom testified that she punched out of work a few minutes before noon and returned home around 12:10 p.m. Brian was already at the duplex before 12:20 p.m., she said. He was wearing a ball cap, and Jesse's mom said she noticed some blondish hair peeking out. Brian promised to return soon and took the SUV and left. Hours later, he wasn't back yet, and Jesse was angry, furious that Brian had stolen the SUV. He was mad enough that he thought about destroying Brian's car with a sledgehammer, but he didn't. Jesse was outside smoking a cigarette when the police swarmed the house. Every police officer in the state of Minnesota was at my house, Jesse's mom testified. She never got paid her $800. She looked right at Brian in the courtroom when she said he still owed her. 29-year-old Jeff K. lived at 24 East Sycamore, an apartment in an older house in St. Paul not far from the state capitol. Several people were staying there. On July 30th, around 6 or 7 p.m., Brian, who was Jeff's occasional roommate and drug dealer, showed up unannounced, just as it was starting to get dark. He said Brian pulled up in Jesse's mom's SUV. Jeff owed Brian a few $100s for drugs and rent, so that's why Jeff assumed Brian had arrived early without any heads up. What was his demeanor? The prosecutor asked. He seemed a little out of it, Jeff testified. A little disconnected, like maybe something had happened. It was unusual for Brian to act that way, Jeff added. He said Brian asked him who was there and then told him not to let anybody else in. He then asked everyone in the apartment to turn their phones off. He said Brian wasn't hiding the fact that he had a black handgun. Jeff could see it plainly. He felt Brian was trying to intimidate the group. He told the court that Brian seemed paranoid. He talked about people snitching and about going someplace he could trust and feel safe. One man mentioned he had a cabin in Luck, Wisconsin. It wasn't a fancy place to stay. The sewer wasn't running, so there weren't any toilets. But Brian didn't seem to care. The man and Brian started to map how to get there. Jeff testified that he was high on meth, but that even in his state of mind, the conversation he was overhearing felt wrong. I didn't feel like it was the smartest thing for me to be at my house, he said. But he joined in, directing Brian how to get to Luck from St. Paul. He said Brian stayed about 30 minutes and then was off. Jeff said he decided to join him. The plan was for him to follow behind Brian in his Jeep and then let Brian take the Jeep to make his escape to Luck. Under cross from the defense, Jeff testified he had last smoked meth a week ago. But the defense attorney accused him of being high right then and there and told the court she wanted her suspicions logged onto the public record. He appeared to be under the influence of something even though he denied it, she told the judge after Jeff's testimony. He didn't seem to be able to control himself. When you asked him questions, he rambled on and on. He yawned. His eyes were droopy like he was falling asleep. And I would wonder if he could understand and appreciate the oath because he was obviously high. The prosecutor argued that Jeff's testimony in court was consistent with his prior statements and that there was no way for the defense attorney to truly know if he was high. His testimony would stand, but it would be up to the jury to decide if he was credible. After the police obtained the green Grand Am, they began getting additional information on their suspect, Brian Fitch Sr.'s whereabouts. They learned Brian was driving around in Jesse's mother's SUV. The tip came from a confidential informant who also told police that he was at Jeff's apartment in St. Paul. Sure enough, the SUV was parked at the parking lot. Police set up surveillance in a nearby cemetery, watching the apartment and waiting for more backup to come so they could devise a plan. But things were happening fast. Around 8 p.m., nearly 8 hours after the shooting, the SUV pulled out of the apartment complex. A Jeep followed. It was Brian on his way to Luck, according to Jeff's testimony, with Jeff following behind in the Jeep. St. Paul Police Sergeant Dylan Flanagan was following the SUV when he lost sight of it. His radio traffic picked it up. I just heard accelerating through stop signs, speeding up, pulling over for lights and sirens, taking a lot of turns, he testified. A convoy of vehicles continued chasing it. Sergeant Flanagan testified they were in full pursuit of Brian Fitch Sr., who they also believed to be armed and dangerous. Under questioning, the defense asked him about the confidential informant that had provided the information on Brian's whereabouts. When you work with informants, they expect something from you in return, Lori Traub pointed out. Not always, Sergeant Flanagan said. He acknowledged that being an informant can be dangerous, however. So sometimes they expect consideration on a charge or a sentence, Traub said. Sometimes, Flanagan agreed. Sometimes they want money, Traub asked. Sometimes, Flanagan said. Sometimes they want other help, Traub asked. Correct. And like she did with most of the law enforcement officials testifying on the stand, Traub asked him if he had ever been in an officer-involved shooting. Once, Sergeant Flanagan said. He said someone had once repeatedly tried to run him over in a car. In their opening statements, the prosecutor told the jury how Brian was finally caught after he left Jeff's apartment. Jeff drove the Jeep behind Brian and pulled over when he saw the cops. Brian kept going. He ignored the flashing lights behind and refused to pull over as Sergeant Flanagan and other officers chased him. Brian went faster, making several turns, but he was going around in a loop. He was almost back to the point where he had started. Just before he reached the police, he made a sharp turn and veered into a parking lot where he hit a curb. And then he refused to get out of the SUV. A gunfight broke out. From the driver's side window, Brian shot at the officers. They also fired. Brian was shot 8 times, but his injuries weren't fatal. He told police he was physically unable to get out of the car and that his gun had fallen to the floor. One official described it as a stalemate. Brian was stuck in the car, and officials, who had just been shot at, waited for the SWAT armored vehicle to arrive on scene to assist them. Officers eventually pulled Brian out of the driver's side window, handcuffed him, and took him to get medical treatment under guard. According to court testimony, Brian wore a baseball cap, and under the cap, he was bald. In his pocket was almost $3,000 cash, along with a hand-drawn map on part of a Jimmy John's bag to Luck, Wisconsin, the prosecutor said in his opening statements. In the blue SUV, police found 4 fired 9mm shell casings. Next to the driver's door in the parking lot, they found another fired 9mm shell casing. Right next to the driver's seat, they found a black Smith & Wesson 9mm semi-automatic handgun with a laser sight. Kurt Moline, a forensic scientist with the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, testified that Brian's 9mm handgun he had at the time of his arrest was the same weapon that had killed Officer Patrick. But according to the defense, Moline had a bias in favor of law enforcement. They argued his analysis on bullet identification was just junk science and didn't mean anything. But prosecutors had another witness and another crime to tell the jury about. Brian survived his injuries from the shootout and was in the medical unit of Oak Park Heights Prison. While behind bars and awaiting his murder trial for Officer Patrick's death, prosecutors say he was plotting to commit another crime. They told the jury that Brian wanted his landlord, Lori, and his girlfriend, Taya, dead. Both Lori and Taya had played important roles for the prosecution. Their testimony connected Brian as the regular driver of the green Grand Am, even though the vehicle wasn't registered to him. Their testimony also made it clear that Brian carried a gun, even though he was an ex-felon, and that he harbored resentment towards the police. 41-year-old Claude Croxon, who was serving a sentence for assault and first-degree battery, met Brian in the prison medical unit. Claude testified that Brian asked him to kill Lori and Taya. Brian told him he had a good target for a robbery, or a lick, as Claude said. He didn't want anything from the lick, Claude testified, according to the Star Tribune. He just wanted them dead. Brian drew a map of the neighborhood where Taya lived at the time with street names and businesses, and an X on where Taya lived with the words top floor. The map was accurate. But instead of going along with it, Claude, who still had years of his sentence to serve, contacted authorities. In his closing arguments, Assistant County Attorney Phil Prokopowicz acknowledged that even though several witnesses caught a glimpse of the green Grand Am driver after the shooting, everyone seemed to have a different memory of what the driver looked like. There were a wide variety of descriptions, he told the jury. You heard that the driver was a white male. You heard that there were two people in the green Grand Am. One person described the driver as light brown-skinned. Early 20s was thrown out. 30s was thrown out. A baseball cap was thrown out. Blonde hair was thrown out. Other witnesses said he was bald. He was sitting up. He was slouching down. A wide variety of descriptions. People trying to do their best in a very chaotic moment. Trying to get the information about what they had seen. How do you weigh that? You can't ignore it. It was testified to. But what emphasis do you put on it? What weight do you give to that? He then answered his own question. It was a passing glimpse. A split second they observed that driver, and most of them just observed just the profile of the driver. And given everything that occurred and how quickly it occurred, probably not so surprising, your common sense, your good judgment, and your life experiences, that you would have a mixture in the descriptions provided by the witnesses. But they were doing their best to give that information and relaying it so that the police departments could get it out to the other officers who were searching for that vehicle. He then reminded the jury of the motive. Brian wanted to do anything to avoid capture because there was an active warrant out for his arrest when Officer Patrick pulled him over. Some parts of the timeline were questioned during the trial, like what time Brian arrived at Jesse's house to pick up the car. He reminded the jury that both Jesse and another woman at the house testified that they had been using meth that day, so their recounts weren't reliable. Jesse's mother didn't notice Brian's green car when she returned home around 12:10 p.m. Under the prosecution's theory, Brian didn't arrive at the duplex until 12:25 p.m., 5 minutes after the shooting. Brian was also facing attempted murder charges in connection to the shootout with police leading up to his arrest. Several law enforcement officials testified how Brian fired at them to avoid being captured. The officials said they had been scared for their lives and believed Brian was trying to kill them. The evidence says it all the evidence, the totality of the evidence, Prokopowicz said. The time has come, ladies and gentlemen. The time has come for justice to be served. Then it was defense attorney Lori Traub's turn. I think the one thing that sticks in my head about this case is how little investigation law enforcement actually did, she said. They decided Brian Fitch was their man almost immediately, and throughout the investigation, once they got something or someone who supported it, they didn't even check to see if that person was honest, or if what that person said could be corroborated by anything. What about Taya Moran? Traub asked the jury if they believed Taya's testimony. It's kind of coincidental, don't you think? Taya was high on meth the night of July 29th. She admitted it on the stand. And her story is that Brian Fitch yelled at her, belittled her, and threatened to kill a cop. I don't know about you, but if a man did that to me, I would suddenly remember I left the stove on at home and I needed to leave, she said. Taya didn't do that. She made love to Brian Fitch, and she laid beside him in bed, and she stayed with him all night. and she did that because that conversation never happened. Brian had been arrested with $3,000, which wasn't a surprise, she said, because Brian was a drug dealer and was out collecting the money people owed him on July 30th. Throughout the day, she said Brian made stops at Dairy Queen and at Jimmy John's, located within blocks of the St. Paul Police Department headquarters. Those mundane errands proved Brian's innocence, she said. That defies logic, and it certainly doesn't show an intention to flee. It shows the behavior of a person who didn't shoot Officer Patrick. And in the shootout where Brian was finally captured, she said it was unclear whether Brian or law enforcement fired first. The shootout happened so fast and was so chaotic, no one knows what really happened. It was so fast and so chaotic that law enforcement was shooting at each other, and they stopped shooting when they realized the fact that they were putting each other's lives in danger. She told the jury that Brian was innocent of the attempted murder charge as well. The prosecution's timeline doesn't fit. The description of the shooter isn't Brian Fitch, and the firearms testimony that is at the center of this case isn't supported by science and isn't reliable. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is not guilty, she concluded. The jury deliberated for 9 hours and then rendered their verdict. They believed the prosecution. Brian Fitch Sr. was found guilty of murdering Officer Patrick, guilty of attempted murder of 3 other officers, and guilty on several lesser charges. Immediately after hearing the verdict, Brian yelled out, "Thanks for your bias-ass, bullshit-ass case. Oh my God." He uttered more profane language until the judge ordered him out of the courtroom. "Take me out, I don't care, stupid-ass bitch," he said to the judge as he was removed. Court was adjourned that day, and Brian, his defense attorney, and the prosecution were back in court in February 2015 for his sentencing. Brian addressed the court. He said, "If the family wants to look at somebody to hate, they can look at me and hate, but I wasn't there during the Dakota County part of this offense. If the police had it their way, they would have killed me. The only reason they stopped shooting at me is because they were shooting at each other. This whole case is trumped up beyond imagine, and I feel bad for their family that they lost their dad and their son. But I'm also a dad and a son. I have a family too. I'm a Christian, and whether I'm locked up or whether I'm free, I'm going to die and go to heaven anyway, so people can hate me all they want. That's all I have to say." Officer Patrick's wife and daughters also got a chance to address the court at the hearing. His wife, Michelle, said, "Officer Patrick has changed more lives than we will ever know. He's changed mine. A part of him will never die. I am still a part of him, and our daughters are a part of him. His family, my family, and the community will always remember him." His daughters talked about the loss of not having their dad there at graduation, or to walk them down the aisle when they got married. His oldest daughter said, "The traumatic part I still face is approximately 5 minutes before he was murdered. He visited my boyfriend and I on our lunch break picnic, and before he drove away, he said, 'I'll see you later, sweetie,' and I'm still waiting." Brian was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. And that's all for this episode. As always, I'd love to know what you think about this case. Let me know by joining the conversation on Instagram at CourtJunkie, by tweeting me at CourtJunkiePod, or by emailing me at podcast@CourtJunkie.com. This case was researched and written by Gabrielle Russon. Today's case was a listener request from Sherry, the niece of the victim in this case. I want to thank Sherry for bringing this trial to my attention and for sharing her uncle's story with us. If you have a case you'd like us to cover, please shoot me an email at podcast@CourtJunkie.com with the subject line listener request. The catch is that it has to be a case that has gone through or is going through the court system. I don't really do any unsolved cases at this time. To hear these episodes without the ads or to hear additional Court Junkie bonus content, Check out my Patreon options at courtjunkie.com/support. Thanks again for listening. Until next time.